Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. Today's episode is entitled Innocent Until Proven Muslim, featuring Dr. Maha Hilal, who delves into the ways the official narrative of the War on Terror has justified the creation of a sprawling apparatus of state violence rooted in Islamophobia and excused its most egregious abuses. Dr. Hilal also discusses the many iterations of the War on Terror in law and policy, the internalization of oppression among Muslim Americans, and the role of influential voices within the Muslim American community in perpetuating collective responsibility. She explores what it means to live as part of a suspect community and how those experiences shape the fight for justice and accountability. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that impacts the civil rights of Muslims across the United States.
Thank you so much, Professor Aziz. It's such an honor to be here with you all today. And thank you to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for holding this conversation and discussion on my book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience since 9/11. So my book is really a culmination of the work, research, writing, organizing that I've done for more than a decade and a half that really looks at the role of Islamophobia in the War on Terror. Last year, in 2021, people were asking around the time of the 9/11 anniversary, the 20th year, and the 20th year of the War on Terror, how we got to where we are today. And so I begin to answer that question with this quote from former President Bush in a speech in 2001, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks on September 20th. In his speech, he says, quote, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or justice to our enemies, justice will be done." And I start with this quote because, for one, this is the first time President Bush uses the term war on terror. And for two, when he talks about justice, what he's saying is that justice is effectively whatever the United States says it is. And when we again look at how we got to where we are today, what Bush was essentially telling us in this speech is that the war on terror will be never ending and nebulous. And he was creating and beginning to create the foundation for a war that continues now 21 years later. Many of you are law students, law professors, law scholars. And so justice is an important question. What is justice in the war on terror? There are 3 quotes here. The first from Biden, who talks about justice in his speech on August 1st, this past year, when he was announcing the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda. And he simply says justice has been delivered. And that's an assertion. And it's not an assertion that's subject to any unique or any objective standards of what justice is. It is simply justice again, because that's what the United States said it. Wrong. This is a quote when he talks about justice from a speech he gave on October 27th of 2019, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was assassinated. And again, he makes the assertion that his assassination was justice. And finally, on May 1st, 2011, President Obama saw justice. And in this quote, he's referring to the assassination of Osama bin Laden. And so again, the important part here is the question of what is justice. In all of these speeches, they do not talk about the legal rationales. Why is this justice? What sanction these tactics in theoretical service of justice. Again, justice is whatever the United States says it. So in my book, and in my work more broadly, I focus heavily on the role of narratives in sustaining, justifying, and perpetuating state violence. So I looked at a couple of narrative themes. The first is the idea that everything changed with 9/11. And why did everything change post 9/11? The reason is because the United States was the victim. There was no other objective reason why the claim could be made that the whole world suddenly changed after 9/11. What did change is the use and justification of narratives that legitimize brute force and a different way of co-opting and coercing states into a new global world order that the United States was creating. Civilization and freedom. Not only were these narratives deployed to say that this is why the United States was attacked, because those who attacked us could not handle civilization and freedom. It was also used, and they continue to be used, in fact, to say that the United States has a unique responsibility to bring civilization and freedom to different parts of the world where coincidentally, right, there happens to be an interest in some sort of military intervention. And these narratives, again, have been deployed over and over and over again. Muslim humanity enraged. So it goes without saying, when we look at the trajectory of the war on terror, Muslims have been seriously dehumanized. The tactics that have been sanctioned and utilized in the war on terror could not have been possible had it not been for the sheer dehumanization. But there are narratives that are specifically deployed towards those ends, and I'll talk about them in just a little bit. It looks like the idea of rage. Why are they rageful? There are numerous pictures of Muslims protesting, looking extremely angry. And the inevitable conclusion, always, is that we simply cannot understand their rage. It is inexplicable. It is inherent to who Muslims are. And that narrative serves a unique purpose, which is to say, if Muslims are irrationally angry and rageful, then we cannot reason with them. And if we can't reason with them, the only intervention becomes brute force. And obviously, in the course of the war on terror, we have seen exactly that. Then terrorism and moral equivalencies. Many of you probably know that there are hundreds of definitions of terrorism, that the state has a monopoly on the definition of terrorism. So who can define what terrorism is? And is an act of violence simply terrorism because of who commits the act rather than what the act is, how much it causes, or who the targets are? And so the United States has employed these narratives, specifically moral equivalencies, to suggest that its violence is inherently superior and moral, and simply cannot be compared to the violence of non-state actors. And if that is the case, then the United States cannot be sanctioned for the violence it utilizes, or the tactics it uses to fight, quote, terrorism, because it's counter-terrorism. We've already defined what terrorism is, and that is unequivocally not our violence. It is the violence of others. In 2004, I'm sure many of you remember this, or are familiar with the war around that happened at Abu Ghraib. And when we look at response, both in terms of the narrative themes that I identify, and in terms of how the United States continues to perpetuate the dehumanization of Muslims, I looked at 3 different responses from President Bush, Rumsfeld, and Colin Powell. And I won't read these quotes verbatim, but if you take a quick glance at them, what each of them are doing are speaking about the moral character of the United States. Now, what happened at Abu Ghraib with the egregious torture is not an indication of what kind of country the United States is. Now, what happened at Abu was simply an exception. And what's noticeably missing from any of these quotes is any regard or remorse for an actual people that suffered and who were victimized by the United States. Instead, what these quotes and individuals deem important is to rectify the image of the United States. And that also serves, again, to dehumanize Muslims. And it's also why I call the section of this chapter not a dent in the earth. And what that means is that no matter what the United States does, no matter what violence it is engaged in, no matter how many times this violence is exposed, its narrative simply do not change. This is always the exception, not the rule. In 2006, when 3 prisoners at Guantanamo allegedly died by suicide, well, there are numerous reports that suggested homicide, but when they allegedly died by suicide, Rear Admiral Jerry Meagher said, quote, "They are smart, they are committed, they have a noble regard for life, either ours or their own." I believe this was an act of desperation, not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us. So you have to imagine the level of dehumanization of Muslims to be able to consider dying by suicide, or at least what they put out as their deaths as suicide, to say that even post-war, these individuals were engaged in warfare, not they were detained indefinitely, tortured, and as a response to that diagnosis, instead, they were using their bodies to engage war once again on the United States. In 2016, in the massacre in Afghanistan, President Obama responded by saying, "It appeared you had a lone gunman on his own. In no way is this representative of the enormous sacrifices that our veterans have made in Afghanistan." Sacrifices for the Afghans who have been killed or the Afghans who have been left to watch their country destroyed. And again, the emphasis is on the character, values, and principles of the United States, not those who have been victimized by its violence. So what is institutionalized Islamophobia? This is central to my book because there are many narratives. There's a lot of research, writing, even in liberal and progressive circles, that see Islamophobia as tangential to the war on terror. That the war on terror has targeted Muslims is a coincidence or is an unintended consequence. Whereas, I argue, Islamophobia is again central, and the war on terror is in fact rooted in the war on terror. So what is Islamophobia? There are a lot of definitions that seek to capture what this phenomenon is meant to describe. I think of Islamophobia as this construction of hate and fear of Muslims that are specifically built into the structures of the state and society for the pursuit of power and the justification of war and repression. The idea of Islamophobia is based on social constructions of Muslims, many of which I'm sure you are familiar with, whether it's that Islam and Muslims are violent, barbaric, uncivilized, inherently opposed to democratic values. And what Islamophobia does is to effectively push Muslims outside of our moral boundaries. And when we do that, our standards of justice and fairness don't apply. And you could argue that we've seen that all along in the war on terror. Because in my observation, perhaps others disagree, there hasn't been a lot of outrage in the war on terror, save, for example, the Iraq War or the Muslim ban, other periods as well. But if we think about the level of the violence and the corresponding outrage, it has been minimal at best. And that is because Islamophobia has successfully positioned Muslims outside of these moral boundaries. And then finally, Islamophobia is rooted in many things, and Muslims are a diverse community. So we have to understand it as operating at the nexus of different intersectional identities. But to me, one of the most important parts is anti-religious animus, that it is about Islam being constructed in a particular way. What is the war on terror? Now, if you look this up, most definitions or most conceptions narrowly describe the war on terror as being about militarism and warfare abroad. And a couple summers ago, for example, when the 1099 program was part of the national discourse, people kept saying that the war on terror had come home. The war on terror has always been at home. The war on terror has operated both domestically and internationally. And when we think about, again, how do we dismantle the war on terror? We have to understand what exactly is the war on terror. What is the purview of the war on terror? So I conceptualize this taxonomy of the war on terror. which includes militarism, warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, detention, and torture. And in my book, I lay out numerous laws and policies that fall under each of these dimensions. And this is not to say that these are the only 5 dimensions, but these are the ways that frequently came up in the research, writing, and analysis that currently exists, is that I could broadly think about these 5 dimensions. Corresponding with these dimensions are what I thought of as modes of violence. There are 5 modes of violence, including corporeal, bordered, panoptic, juridical, and carceral. Some of these directly correspond with the dimensions and the taxonomy of the war on terror, and there are overlapping modes of violence that correspond with each dimension. So let's talk about each one. You can probably read the quote at the bottom. If you can't, it says, "It turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that that was going to be a strong suit of mine." President Obama, obviously something to be very proud of. So what is corporeal violence? Corporeal violence is a part of militarism and warfare. The state exercises its control of the means of violence directly through the infliction of both psychological and physical harm, as well as death, including by the military. Bordered. Hopefully you can read that, but just in case, from President Trump, just put out a very important policy statement on the extraordinary influx of hatred and danger coming into our country. We must be vigilant. So bordered violence via draconian immigration policy is also a direct exercise of state power in terms of sovereignty. But here, control of physical borders is leveraged against target groups through coercion, such as by restricting immigration or conditioning status on cooperation with state objectives. Panoptic. Some of you might remember the story of Ahmed the clock boy, who went to school proud of building a clock at home by himself and ended up being arrested the same day, was subsequently invited by President Obama to the White House, even though Obama, of course, unironically, if you know about CVE, was the one who spearheaded the program that effectively demonized Muslims and put a panoptic gaze onto our communities. So what is panoptic violence? Panoptic violence using surveillance is when the state uses its power to surveil in order to control targeted groups by denying them the autonomy inherent in the ability of a person to conduct a private life with the certainty that the state, at least, is not a threat to their safety. Juridical. The case that is quoted here is of a man named Tariq Mahenna. Perhaps some of you have read about his case, charged with material support, among other things, for translating Al-Qaeda material independently, although the state argued it was at the behest of Al-Qaeda. This is just a portion of his statement that he gave at his sentencing hearing, and I encourage you to read the entire thing. And for the sake of time, I won't read it now. It's quite long, but it's very powerful and really highlights much of the hypocrisy in the national security apparatus. So what is juridical violence? This includes, but is not limited to, federal terrorism prosecutions. In this context, juridical refers to the procedural power of the state to deny its victims legal recourse, including by barring access to the justice system altogether or by wielding the judicial process against them. And finally, carceral violence. You can see the quote on the bottom. It's of a note that Donald Rumsfeld wrote on one of the infamous torture memos, asking why standing as a torture technique was limited to 4 hours. So carceral violence in the form of detention and torture refers to the state's physical control over the bodies of its victims, which facilitates the ability to inflict harm in various ways, from the psychological harm of being detained, often indefinitely and without cause, to the use of torture. And there's obviously overlap between this mode and corporeal violence. Is the war on terror over? Does anyone think the war on terror is over? Hopefully not, because it's not. But last year, when President Biden withdrew troops from Afghanistan, he kept saying that the war on terror was over. And to him, or at least what he wanted to construct the perception of, was that the war was over because the troops had been withdrawn. Never mind, obviously, the role of the CIA, over-the-horizon capabilities, etc., in perpetuating violence. But that is to narrowly conceive what it means to say that a war is over. War is not just about the presence of troops on the ground. And so, to help answer this question, I refer to a quote from a young Pakistani boy who testified in Congress in 2013 in a drone warfare hearing and said, quote, "I no longer love blue skies. In fact, I now prefer gray skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are gray. When the sky brightens, drones return and we live in fear." So war is omnipresent, and the war on terror is omnipresent. And to me, there is still a war if a child looks up into the sky and the color of the sky determines their level of fear, that the color of the sky indicates to them how precarious their lives are. That is when war is still there. And the war on terror, whether visible or not, whether overt or not, still continues. And what has happened in the war on terror is that it has been so normalized that at this point, it's hard to understand how we can extract this violence from our daily lives. So here is graffiti from a wall in Yemen. This graffiti is juxtaposed against two quotes, one from President Bush and one from Obama. In both, they are referring to the concept of evil. Of course, Bush is directly referring to the 9/11 attacks, and President Obama giving this statement shortly before the 13th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And the reason I juxtapose this is because the use of the word evil is meant to denote inherent characteristics, to say that Muslims and those constructed as terrorists, often, of course, conflated with Muslims, are evil. But isn't it evil to inflict drone warfare on innocent civilians? So when we juxtapose these quotes against this graffiti, the message that I want to impart, and what I try to do in my book, is to say that whoever has the power of language and rhetoric has the power to define the terms on which the war has been fought and continues to be fought. And in the course of the war on terror, that has squarely been the United States. And finally, with a war on terror that was designed to be never-ending and nebulous, it goes without saying that it is time to dismantle and abolish this apparatus, which has claimed too many lives, which have led to communities living in fear and precarity, and which have destroyed our sense of community and society.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.